Well, I'd like to welcome you all once again to this session. It's been extremely productive, and I think what we've been doing is just looking at the entire G20 process. It is also important to remember that B20, which represents the business end of the G20 process, is something which is being looked at very closely at this stage in Delhi. And I think as part of the B20 process, there are several, about 10 key processes that they're looking at to make the entire G20 agenda accessible and relevant to more than 1 billion plus around the world, certainly in the G20 grouping. We've got wonderful panelists with us today, representing a cross-section of interests. Let me come to you first, Mr. Singh, and ask you this question. One of the key issues that G20 is looking at is the issue of inclusion. It's key, of course, to India's economic growth, but it is also a G20 agenda. How?
Well, in multiple ways. First and foremost, that the digital story, which was rolled out in India with great alacrity, great success, is altering the architecture of governance. And the example of this altered architecture, of the empowerment which it has done in terms of gender empowerment, in terms of access to public services, in terms of the way in which the architecture of governance had hitherto been organized, being altered in fundamental, unrecognizable ways. That's one important takeaway from this G20. And I was in a session just now on exactly this very issue, which you have asked, and I'm sure that my colleague here, Veera, would like to add her own voice along with Borje on this very important question which you have raised.
In fact, let me go across to Mr. Render first about digitalization. And we've discussed this earlier, you and I, but I think it's worth repeating. India's digitalization model, can it be replicated elsewhere, and if so, how?
First part of the question, yes, and second part of the question, hopefully. I think part of the reason why India now 3 years in a row has the fastest economic growth of any of the large economies is based on the digital ID where you started. 1.4 billion people have their digital ID. And if you look at India, the digitalization rate, people that have access to a cell digitally connected is just amazing. And if you look overall globally, it is close to 4 billion people that are not digitally connected with affordable prices. So this is a huge comparative advantage for India now moving forward. I just saw the other day on TV a grandmother, I think it was the state of Assam, sitting there with her cell and wiring money to the grandchildren on her own cell. Where else is that happening? And if India is 1.4 billion people digitally connected, and there are 4 billion people not digitally connected, you can just think of 7 billion people, you have a huge, huge advantage. That's why we urgently have to connect the 3.5 to 4 billion people that are not connected. That's a prerequisite for economic growth, it's a prerequisite for meeting the SDGs, and it's a prerequisite for poverty eradication.
And ma'am, it's also about, ultimately it's all about inclusion. We're talking about digitalization without necessarily having referred to what the end game is, and that is inclusion. It's inclusion of women, of men, of children. It's about ensuring basic fundamental rights. Therefore, when we talk about digitalization, what is it about digitalization that appeals most to you in the context of development?
No, thank you very much. I think 3 things. The first one is, as you said, inclusion. And Borge talked about the 3.5 billion people that are not included, most of them in the developing world. And so the question for me for financial inclusion is a macro and a micro issue. The first one is when you're not, if you're not financially inclusive, for those who are out of it, not having access to financial tools is a terrible thing. And poverty is a terrible thing. And we see that when we have crises, like the COVID crisis. The first thing that happens is the developing world cannot buy and cannot access COVID and COVID vaccines, right? And so essentially what you need is at that macro level to get inclusion right. Because you must get inclusion right at the macro level, which means global cost and access to financing. We cannot have spreads, credit spreads of sovereign bonds that are 10% different from emerging market economies and developed economies. You cannot have negative transfers going from the developed to the developing countries on the capital markets. So first of all, we must have equal or close to equal access to capital markets, which means developing our capital markets institutions. Secondly, and something that we talk about a lot, is local currency investment and growth. If you don't have that, then we are not really talking about the right kind of financial inclusion at that global level for investment. Now you come to the micro level, and what does that mean? When we talk about, and we have another word for talking about non-inclusion, which is essentially the informal economy. The conversation around the informal economy is really about non-inclusion, and I think that what India is doing with the Aadhaar program is really about including people, first of all, in the financial sector, and the minute you have enough information about them, they become formal. We can actually bring the SMEs in, we can grow them faster, and they can actually become then job-creating entities. And that is why you are the fastest growing economy in the world, because your Aadhaar economy is now paying off. People are joining the formal economy, people are employing others, and they're creating value. And I think if we don't have that globally, we cannot get the kind of growth that we need to get out of this crisis.
Yeah, and so just, and go ahead, but I wanted to ask you, just using two of the words that were referred to, inclusion and equal opportunity, two terms, one of the areas where India really prides itself and has a role is in medicine. We are called the pharmacy of the world. And the fact that during COVID, we worked towards the inclusion of people around the world with our vaccines, it's something which can be replicated in the future as well. Is that an area, pharma and medicine, where you see India potentially having a lasting imprint within the G20 and outside? Mr. Singh.
Well, let me first add something to what Veera said, with which I fully agree, and thank you, Boshe, for pointing out the huge implications this has for empowering a lot of people who are outside this digital framework. Let me say that from the macroeconomic perspective point of view, something, Veera, which you touched per se, digital access is also a growth disruptor. People are concerned with the enigma that given a lot of other disabilities, how is it that India is now the fastest growing economy of the world? This is because economic models do not work when you introduce a disrupting factor. That disrupting factor is technology with a medium of digital access. So I think as we go forward, the world will learn the power increasingly from experiments of the kind which we are having on what it can do to disrupt the typology of growth and of growth projections, which is the basis on which all macroeconomic projections are made. So the power of the digital world and the conquest of the digital world is going to be growth supportive, a growth disruptor, as technology will break down earlier models and earlier calculus on which growth projections and linear programming was made.
Yeah. Would you like to take that question on India being the pharma of the world, the pharmaceutical sort of headquarters, in a sense, of the world? And therefore, when we're talking about inclusion, when we're talking about equal opportunity, what role does India have towards meeting the medical requirements of countless people?
So I think many are aware that India is the back office of the world. Is now increasingly also playing a role in manufacturing. But what many forget is on the pharmaceutical side, India is world leading. I think maybe 70 to 80% of all antibiotics that are produced globally come from this country. And this is a sector that also leads to the need for a lot of R&D. and also investments. So I think India has a huge opportunity to go from manufacturing, also when it comes to pharmaceutical products, generic products, to also invest and be the developer and have the patents, and then you have the whole value chain. So I think this is another area where India has to go for the full value chain in the future, and to start with part of it also gives you insights where you can then leapfrog later on. And this is a challenge for many emerging economies and developing economies, that what you export cheap and then you have to buy expensive. India is maybe breaking that impasse.
Sure. Ma'am, let me ask you this. When we talk, if we look at the agenda of the G20 and B20 as well, there's a lot of focus on establishing resilient supply chains. Now, this is important because when you use the words resilient supply chains, it can refer to everything from food to superconductors. But let's focus on what affects countries in the G20 and beyond. We are facing a crisis with the Ukraine war, huge food inflation, oil inflation. So therefore, again, as part of the G20 concerns and agenda, how is ensuring resilient supply chains a key part of it?
I think it's three things. There is, of course, the big new term that we have learned post-COVID, which is friendshoring,
Right.
which means bringing supplies closer to home. What we have seen in economies like China, even like the United States, is there is so much of growth that you can generate with domestic consumption. But at some point, you need to go out and trade matters. And I think, again, the two largest trading partners in the world, the United States and China, still traded $9 billion, even as we talked about friendshoring. And we know that trade is really the driver of growth and the thing that lifts most people out of poverty the fastest and delivers financial inclusion. Now, as we move towards this sort of discussion, I think friendshoring is another term, maybe for some people call it deglobalization. I don't believe that's going to happen because at the end of the day, since we're in the B20 summit, the business community is looking at delivering shareholder value, and they have to optimize shareholder value. And my sense is that as one does that, one is going to go back to centers of the world where you have the best comparative advantage and where you can do that trade. Having said that, I don't think that before we started talking about friendshoring, we had optimized those trade relations. And so we can do much, much better. And that's a little bit what Brenda was talking about in terms of, yes, India used to export pharmaceutical products, but had you done it the best? I look at Africa, for example. When you look at a country like Kenya, Kenya produces antibiotics. But we haven't worked together to optimize the chain. I think we import, and what we found out in COVID is we import about 60% of the inputs for the production of antibiotics from India. But that supply chain was not optimized. And we can do that better. We can do that better by defining your private sector and our private sector. Same thing with Egypt, right? In Egypt, when the COVID crisis hit, Egypt is one of the largest producers of pharmaceutical products on the continent. But they overproduce for the continent and under-export. Yeah. And so we can, again, optimize those markets with yourselves and ourselves. And my sense is that once we sort of revisit our supply chain conversation, we hopefully will find better optimization of some of those processes and products to be able to make sure that, because every product that we produce, I think we learned that the COVID vaccine has 140 inputs produced globally. And each one of those has a center where you can do it the best, the fastest, and the cheapest. And that's part of financial inclusion, is getting access to something at its cheapest cost. So my sense is we will work better on that. As a large country like yourselves, you can first optimize that just in India. Sure. And that's what's going to power your growth even better.
Mr. Brenda, over the last several years, the World Economic Forum has obviously changed your agenda, your outlook to reflect newer concerns and newer realities. One of the realities, of course, is climate change and sustainable growth. Do you find the WEF's agenda in that regard very aligned, in a sense, to what we are seeing at G20?
Very much so. I think we're on a daily basis seeing that this climate crisis is not something that our children or grandchildren will be faced with. That's what we used to say. We're doing it to secure their future. I think climate change is happening here and now, and we're paying a price. We see it, for example, affecting agriculture production many places. The reality is that the cost of inaction now clearly exceeds the cost of action. But we are not seeing enough action, but I think India's G20 presidency underlines also the need of a faster decarbonization. And I think we need to change the perspective. It is cheaper to deal with it than just to postpone this change that is necessary. And also comes a lot of business opportunities with the decarbonization. But we are also reminded that it is tough, because it's like a squaring the circle in the sense that there is a lot of people even lacking access to basic electricity. We've seen also energy security issue in Europe. So how to make sure that you go towards a decarbonization, but at the same time you're able to deal with the energy challenges and access challenges. Because without access to energy, there will be no real development. Yep. And here, I think we need to be realistic with building bridges. There are, of course, better with natural gas than with coal. There's also better with fossil fuel if it's captured and stored. Of course, that is not the final solution, but until you get breakthroughs on technology and you get also cheaper energy like solar and wind as an alternative to the fossil fuel ones, you also have to think in a holistic way. And things do change very fast. If we had this conversation 3 years ago, I am not sure if AI was going to be mentioned at all. Of course, with my two very smart colleagues on the panel, they might have raised it. But you see how things change fast and new things come in. If we had this conversation 10 years ago and I said, oh, solar would go down to 1/10 of the price, or I would say wind would go down to 1/7 of the price in 10 years, people would say, oh, that guy is a little bit blue-eyed, you know, he's a bit naive. But no, many places in the world, solar is competitive. It's even cheaper than alternatives, and there's no subsidies needed. And there is like the new era, and I'm not going to be that long, but that also NK mentioned. The new technologies are also changing the way we have to think around economics. I was thinking when the Americans launched this new supply side economics with having a big stimulus in the middle of a situation where they tried to raise the interest rate, that this was going to be very, very challenging. And it seems like they're balancing it in quite a good way. So I think we have to look at austerity differently, but I also think we have to look at fiscal stimulus in a more positive way if it is targeted towards what we really want to achieve, digital inclusion, transformation of the way we produce energy, and etc.
So let me ask you this, Mr. Singh. Are you satisfied at the pace at which the cost of green energy solutions is coming down? Some would suggest it's not coming down fast enough.
Well, I think that whereas we can have 2 points of view on whether the speed of the decline in the cost, availability, and access of green energy is coming down or not, I think one of the very important enigmas is the financing of an orderly transition. And this is easier said than done, Vishnu. In the panel of which Veera is an important member, along with Larry Summers and myself, we are trying to estimate, and that's the heart of the reform of the multilateral development banking system, what is the financing requirement between now and 2030 to be able to have an orderly transition to a period in which dependence on renewable energy is high. That cost, in a brilliant report done by Veera, is estimated to be roughly $3 trillion a year. And $3 trillion, if we assume the $2 trillion out of the 3, come from domestic resource mobilization through much better economic management policy to growth and tax buoyancy and all the virtuous circles around it, that leaves $1 trillion. $1 trillion is a challenge which we are working on, of which 500 billion is from private capital. And therefore, what kind of incentive structures and catalyzation can be done to private capital of $500 billion a year in terms of risk mitigation, in terms of other measures. And then the balance 500 billion, which we hope can come through tripling the lending capability of multilateral development banks. Now, to give you a ballpark figure, Vishnu, all multilateral development banks, and there are many more than you can count. They are much beyond Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's a large family. If all of this is added, roughly speaking, they lend about $120 billion a year. The challenge that Veera and I are facing is how do you take $120 billion closer to $120 billion closer to $400 billion a year, which is tripling their lending capability. And what combination of measures will achieve that? What harnessing of innovative private capital, blended finance, hybrid capital, and what are those structures and mechanisms? I emphasize mechanisms. I emphasize mechanism because only yesterday and today, a mechanism was being talked about in the B20. And this is the connection that I see, or whether a part of the realization from what we call corporate social responsibility, in which India again has taken a lead. We are in the first country to have corporate social responsibility. Whether a fraction of that could go towards the ability to leverage fresh capital for mitigating the problems of climate, pandemic, transboundary challenges, and global public goods.
Ms. Songwe, the future of the B20, the G20 as a grouping, and indeed if you look at countries around the world, rests closely with skilling and mobility and reskilling. Could you tell us a little bit more about how this is essential, because ultimately employment will improve the status of lives, countless?
No, thank you. And just to pick up on the points that were made, and the two meet, when you think about it, one of the reasons India is growing so fast is because the electric vehicle industry is booming, and we need to do that, and we need to do that more. 60 million more electric vehicles will be on our roads by 2050. For that, you need to be able to reskill. As I was listening to the CEO of Ford Motors the other day, and somebody asked him, so how do you think about Tesla coming into your market? And he goes, you know, Tesla is an IT company, we make cars, and Tesla has realized that designing cars is not that easy. And then the next day, they made a cooperative agreement. But beyond that, they also made a cooperative agreement with a mining company that does the chips. And my sense is we need to reskill as we talk about this transition, and this is the climate economy. And one of the things that we say in this report, and you should all look at it, which is the trebling report, part of it is to build the capacity of the MDBs to do precisely that reskilling. We're going to need to take people from, you know, the financing, the banking sector to the digital banking sector. We're going to take people from just collecting data to data centers and AI. We're going to move people from fixing cars to being technologists that can actually make sure that you can drive a Tesla. And this is a whole reskilling process. And yesterday, we were in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. I was in Washington, D.C. And in the restaurant, they have a robot that shows you to your seat. Except that when you have tight restaurants, it shows you to your seat, but it blocks your seat. And so a human has to come and punch the process. But in Nairobi, we have a center called the iCloud Factory. And it's an amazing place. You go in there, and there's at least 3,000 young women especially, but also men who are in the university studying engineering. And they essentially program the driverless cars in California. They do the work for the football teams, and they sort of, and so my sense is the digital economy, the climate economy, are going to be more job creating, but the only way they can do that is if we do this reskilling and we begin to train. It's not going to be a job destroyer. It's going to destroy some of the basic hand jobs that we do, but it's going to create a lot more jobs. And that is where we need the private sector. That is where we need multilateral development banks. And that is why we need the 400 billion. I want to end there. It's really in the report that we did on the trebling. It's really about trebling financing, but also trebling capacity. We must do the capacity bit. And the reason India is doing so well is you have done the capacity bit as well. If you had only done the IT bit, you would have gone no way. But measuring and bringing the IT bit, the capacity bit, and finally the regulatory bit together is what delivers value and growth.
You know, we were talking about job creation. I know that the World Economic Forum deals a lot with artificial intelligence, AI, and its future and its potential economic impact. Are you someone who believes that that might result in a loss of jobs?
I totally agree with what Overa said. If you can upskill, right skill people, there's huge opportunities also coming out of the fourth industrial revolution, including with artificial intelligence. So you also have to, you know, Churchill once said that the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And if you go through, start with the Industrial Revolution and go until today, all the different parts of the Industrial Revolution has led to that some jobs will then be, you will have to change, and some jobs are lost, but all the phases have created new opportunities where you can produce higher up in the value chain, and when you can produce and increase productivity, that's also increasing prosperity. I don't think there is any reason why this new phase of the industrial development will lead to less jobs. I think it will lead to more jobs and more interesting jobs, higher up in the value chain, higher prosperity, and increased and productivity. So, but of course there are some prerequisites for success here, and I'm worried that this winner takes it all that we have seen also when it comes to technology. We've seen it on the companies, and all this can continue. And here, I think we need to invest in developing countries also to give them the same opportunities, because there's then a lot of positive dividend when it comes to demography in these countries. And the young people are the ones that are really, really smart, and that we have to give opportunities in this new area. So of course, some of the old jobs will not be there in the future, but I think there will come better jobs. But you know, you have no, when there are so fundamental changes, you have no guarantee, even if you're doing well today, that you will do well tomorrow. If you look at, for example, the 10 companies that have the highest value today, market value, 20 years ago, 4 or 5 of them did not exist.
Right.
So in 20 years, I'm pretty sure there will be new companies there that maybe are startups or unicorns today. And 1/3, and India is number 3 in the world when it comes to these startups, so huge opportunities in these countries. And it's the same with countries. Like if you look at Argentina in 1945, it was maybe the 2nd richest country in the world. They took the Peronistas 10 years, and then it was a lower middle income country. So look at the new technologies, embrace them, educate your people. If you have a good governance, you can also thrive and prosper.
Mr. Singh, one final question to you as we wrap this up. Mr. Boga referred to he referred to startups. Now, we've been the startup capital in a sense of the world, but we've seen a little bit of a change. We've seen some companies not do as well as they expected to, a shakeout in a certain sense. Are you still optimistic about India continuing to be a major startup hub in the world?
Of course, I still continue to see India to be not only the prime mover, a catalytic, but an important destination for startups. I did say in the earlier part of this interview that technology is an enabler, but also a disruptor. I think that we are undergoing a period of that readjustment of startups with newer technologies in the horizon, with newer challenges in the horizon. I think as we readjust and recalibrate, I see that the vibrancy which we talked about in the startup will come back to this country with even greater force. Let me finally say, the first question which you had asked, Vishnu, was about the fact of the synergy between B20 and G20. India, in a couple of months from now, would hand over the presidency of the G20 to another developing country, which is Brazil. But as you know, Vishnu, the terminology of G20 is like a rolling stone. Every year, the presidency changes. What will be so vastly different about India handing over is that it has, in this period, managed to gather moss, indeed green grass, and that would be consistent with the Prime Minister's vision of handing over a green grass-grown presidency to its successors.
I think that's a wonderful opportunity to end this conversation. I'd like to thank the three of you very much for being with us. Lots to think about, not just about G20 this time, about where we are headed. Thank you very much indeed.